hearing. Topic: text amendment to St. Helens Community Development Code related to auxiliary dwelling units, home occupations, and significant wetlands and riparian area upland protection zones. And I'm going to turn it over to our city planner, Jacob Greichen.
Thank you, Mayor. So you get to listen to me talk again. I'm sincerely apologetic for that. This is a legislative land use hearing. The subject of this hearing are amendments to the St. Helens Development Code, and the applicant is the City of St. Helens. Because legislative proceedings require the observance of certain procedural formalities, the council must take a few moments to cover some preliminary matters and required statements. So does any councilor wish to declare a conflict of interest or bias in this matter?
No.
Excellent. Does anyone from the audience want to object to the councilor, any councilor, to make a fair decision on this matter? Seeing none, fantastic. So the rules and the conduct of the hearing are set forth in the handout out in the back of the table. Generally, the order of proceedings will be just like the last hearing: required statements, which I'm doing now, staff report, the applicant presentation, which is kind of the same as the staff report in this case, since we're the applicant. Those in favor, those opposed, rebuttal, close of the hearing, close of the record, deliberations, and decision. So we have to make some required statements, and those are that the standards for the decision are based on St. Helens Municipal Code 1720-120, subsection 1, standards for legislative decision. All testimony, arguments, and evidence must be directed towards the applicable standards as listed or other criteria in the code or plan which the person believes applies to the decision. So I do have a some text slides to help present what we're doing. So the first thing we can talk about is home occupations. So what is a home occupation? So when we have our land use regulations governed by zoning, you know, you have commercial here, industrial there, residential there. And so in your pure residential neighborhoods, generally you don't allow grocery stores and stuff like that. But cities and counties do have provisions that allow what's called a home occupation. And what a home occupation is a business venture inside a dwelling that's limited in nature, so it doesn't supersede the use as a dwelling, but allows some small-scale business venture. You can consider it an incubator to our future business leaders. And in the city of St. Helens, we have Type 1 and Type 2 home occupations. Type 1 home occupations exhibit no evidence that a business is occurring. There's no signage, there's no employees, there's no exterior storage. It could be a home office for online sales. It could be a home office for janitorial work that occurs elsewhere. So there's really no impact to neighbors. And pushing paper on these for now 11 years, I'm like, why am I doing this? What am I accomplishing? It seems like senseless bureaucracy with no purpose. That's the Type 1. So Type 2 home occupations do have potential evidence that a business is occurring. You could have customers, you could have signage, things of that nature. So a good example we've seen here and there is someone who styles hair at their home. They have customers, and there are limitations in the code. And so the proposal here is to basically, we're on to the next slide, get rid of the Type 1s, and then the Type 2s just become home occupations. It's going to affect some of our annual numbers, and so we'll have to remember to reflect that. There's a couple years there. The last full year I've worked, and the first full year I've worked, you can see kind of a spread where, sometimes we could have up to 8 Type 2s in a year, and sometimes we have 1, but usually there's a lot of Type 1s. And I'm looking forward, provided that the council approves this, when someone comes in for a business license and they say, well, there's not going to be any evidence of a business. Perfect. You're done with me. No paperwork, no fee. And and no time wasted on something which I feel is unnecessary, and then we can, focus on things that really matter. And it's one small step that we can take to be a little more business friendly to our home businesses. In the discussion with the Planning Commission, some other things came up. One of them was removing vehicular signage as an issue to trigger home occupation. And there's a couple reasons for that. In our sign code, which regulates signs, some signs are hard to regulate. And one of those is vehicle signs. And so if our sign code doesn't regulate it, why would we make it an issue for home occupations? And then, how much of a sign on a car matters? And especially now that you have, painting a sign on a car used to be very expensive, but now there's that plastic wrap you can put on there so it's more accessible. And it's a hard thing to regulate, so why even go there? So we're removing that as an issue that would trigger what we're calling the home occupation. Currently under current law, it'd be type 2. Home occupations can be allowed anywhere where dwelling units are possible. So you see a whole list of zoning districts there. Of course, the dwelling unit must be legal. Someone can't build a legal house and say, well, I want a home occupation here. And then the Planning Commission also wanted to add a clause about being able to impose conditions if there's hazardous materials used. The building and fire codes already do that, but having extra leverage in the case that would be an issue doesn't hurt. In my experience, we haven't seen that, but it's always good to be prepared because when you get that one, it's nice to have the tools to deal with it. So that's home occupations. I know our associate planner will be thrilled to get rid of those as well, and I urge you to adopt that. I don't imagine any controversy on it, but we haven't heard any speak, so we'll see. The second issue I want to cover briefly, and this was kind of something we added last minute to this batch of amendments, was our wetland and riparian buffer rules. It kind of came up in the discussion, and I kind of crossed my fingers and hoped for an easy fix. And all I did in the amendments was cross out one number and add a new one to try to reduce the protection buffer requirements we have for wetlands. Well, unfortunately, the state does pay attention. They pushed back. They told us that the Goal 5 process is necessary, which is it's time consuming. And if you note that the ordinance, when the Planning Commission, or I guess when the council adopted our current wetland rules, the ordinance noted that the Planning Commission spent over 2 years developing those rules. And so just snapping our fingers and changing it, it may not honor that effort, and the state wouldn't let us do that anyways. So that's something we'll have to kind of tackle ahead of time. The good news is I did learn some things, and I kind of know where the fudge factor is a little bit too. So we're not proposing to change the rules, but I did want to talk about them since it came up a little bit. But the main catalyst for this batch of code amendments is auxiliary or accessory dwelling units. So what is or otherwise known as an ADU? This term has been in the news quite a bit lately, and not surprising because the state adopted a law that said cities and counties over a certain population have to have rules in effect. And we, with our population of about 13,000, we're well above the threshold. And technically, it was supposed to be adopted by June 30th. But note, since 1999, the city of St. Helens has had ADU rules. And in my time here, I've had a lot of time, 11 years to go through files, and I've never seen a permit issued. And we have had inquiries. And I think when we start talking about the requirements, well, you need a conditional use permit, public hearing, owner occupied, their eyes get wide and they run away screaming. And what the objective of the state's bill is to increase affordable housing options. And when this originally came up, so this winter, speaking to other planners, other people in the private sector, engineers, architects, typically the winter slows down a little bit, and that's a good time to work on other things that may be sitting to the side. This winter didn't really happen because the economy is good, people are building, and I remember when this bill came out, a lot of swear words starting coming through my mind. Oh man, we got to deal with this, and I was a little resistant to it at first, just because of time and just processing permits. But a couple things happened. One was the Community Action Team adopted a county housing report, and they had a recommended strategy of having accessory dwelling rules with best practices, which our ADU rules were kind of old school and a little arduous. And the other thing was we felt it was the right thing to do, and sometimes with the council, it's when you don't see the torches and pitchforks when you know things are being done right. And when we could have just said, well, we have rules, we don't have to do anything. But with a lot of cities changing their rules, I think if we didn't do anything, you would have had the torches and pitchforks. So we wouldn't have bit the bullet. It wasn't a very fun time to do code amendments because, you want to make sure the language is right. And it did slow, because of our limited staff, it certainly slowed me down being able to review development proposals, but we bit the bullet and did it. Something I want to mention that's relevant to what we did with our rules, the Community Action Team housing report, which came out in December, talks about making ADUs easily permitted in single-family dwellings, getting rid of the owner occupancy clause, which is a typical old-school element, which means you have your principal dwelling, you have your accessory dwelling, and an owner is supposed to occupy one of those. And this is very important, that they're not absorbed as vacation rentals. So let's talk about our rules. So our rules currently say we can have one ADU per lot or parcel developed with a detached single-family dwelling. And the most common form of residential use we have is the standard classic detached single-family dwelling. One per parcel. Some larger cities are going with two. I think Portland maybe. I know some cities in Canada are going with two, but we're sticking with one, like a lot of small jurisdictions. You can create them through a variety of means. You can convert existing living area. So let's say you have a fairly large house and you have a basement. You can convert that to an ADU. You can have a house and create an addition to have the ADU. You can build a new detached ADU that could be a tiny home on a foundation or something stick-built, or you can convert an existing accessory structure. And that last one came up. It was kind of, sometimes when we get questions at the counter, they can be very useful. And when we were starting to develop these rules, I had someone who had a property in our urban growth boundary, but not in city limits, and they talked about connecting to sewer, and they talked about the county's rules and city's rules, and they wanted to have a shop that they can convert. And it got me thinking, well, that's not something I really thought about. And so that's something we chewed on with the Planning Commission and added some rules to make that a possibility. We removed the owner occupancy requirement because it's seen as a barrier. And then, we have to deal with parking. We know we're a community, and some neighborhoods have cars all over the place. And we didn't really change our rules too much, but the way they work is no new parking if the abutting street is at least 20 feet wide and allows on-street parking. You would need to add one new parking space for an ADU if what I just said isn't the case, or if it's built at the same time as the principal dwelling. The idea that it's built at the same time is you can, make sure that your site design accommodates that. Minimum size, our code originally did have a minimum size, but the building code addresses it. So why do we need to put that in the development code? It's senseless. So we took that out. Maximum size, now we have a whole slide based on this. And this was one of the major discussion items that the Planning Commission had. So the first thing we need to look at when we talk about size is one of the design standards of our code says that ensure auxiliary dwelling units are smaller than the principal unit. And that makes sense because they're supposed to be secondary or accessory to the main or principal dwelling unit. So with that in mind, we looked at our current standard, which said it could be no more than 30% of the living area of your principal dwelling or 1,000 square feet, whichever is less. Based on a lot of testimony we had, the Planning Commission increased that to 1,200 square feet. So increased it a little bit based on some testimony we had about, how much floor space you may need for someone who is disabled. And then the other thing we did is we added that it be no more than 75% or the 1,200, whichever is less. And the state recommended 75, so that's where we pulled that number. I believe the city of Scappoose is 50%. Now, when the Planning Commission originally made their formal recommendation, it was getting late. And when you work all day and then you have a night meeting, sometimes you're a little mentally tired, which you probably all can appreciate. And I at that time, I wasn't thinking about it's supposed to be smaller and that stuff. And so the Planning Commission didn't formally vet the 75%. And the other thing that we kind of thought about based on some other examples we saw was looking at the height. And so we added a clause about the height of the ADU not being greater than the principal dwelling unit. But we did speak with the Planning Commission about this yesterday to make sure we kind of had their blessing, and they were okay with it. Interestingly, though, they kind of started talking about the owner occupancy, and actually the majority of them pushed back on that. Their concern was family structure and predictability, basically a livability standpoint, which, you get, it's this classic issue of, owner occupied versus rental, and what's that going to do to the feeling of the neighborhood. I don't know if we really want to go there because all the best practices say that's a bad idea. Also, it's not an easy thing to enforce either. But since they talked about it, I thought it was appropriate to at least bring that to your attention. One thing that we didn't really change too much, but is in our code, if we go to the next slide, was standards as to appearance. And basically, exterior finished materials, roof pitch, trim, windows, eaves, those things are supposed to be similar to the dwelling. That way, in the neighborhood, it's not detracting too much from the feel of it. But we did put an exception for using existing lawful accessory structures to convert. We felt, well, if someone had some old shop that was there from the 50s, it's still sound, it may look totally different from the house, we shouldn't prohibit that from being able to be converted. If it's a sound structure, it should be allowed. And so we added that exception for that. We addressed addressing. The reason we did that is, sometimes we like to put little popcorn trails. We deal with so many different things. We wanted to make sure that the address would have the same number, but just have like a unit letter like B. So if you have a principal dwelling that's 101 Annie Street, it would be 101B. And when we look at, is that an ADU or not, we have a variety of things to consider, including the address. And so that's why we added that, just another token of to understand into the future, especially because I don't think we have any under permit at this time. That's going to help us. Is that an ADU or not? We did include some provisions where ADUs should be prohibited. Those include wetlands and riparian areas, the protections of those, and also in floodplains. One, because our rules are supposed to preserve wetlands and those things, and so we just wanted to take the argument out of that. And then floodplain regulation is all about mitigation loss, and so one easy way to mitigate loss is to prohibit construction therein. So that's why we added that. And then just one more slide to go. Prohibited uses in an ADU. And this is based on the CAT study, Community Action Team study, that talked about not wanting short-term rentals. The Planning Commission actually thought of this independently, which I thought was really interesting. Because the idea for the ADU is to help as one of the tools. It's not the be-all, end-all tool, but one of the tools to help with affordable housing. But the key thing is affordable long-term housing. And we didn't want to see the ADUs being taken up for short-term rental uses. And so that was added in there. We do allow home occupations. Of course, we know a little bit about those since we talked about it. And then permitting. What's the bureaucracy related to it? So we're taking away the conditional use permit. We're taking the public hearing before the Planning Commission because that's considered a barrier. And, we want these to be more accessible to people. So it would make an administrative decision, which is going to make it quicker, less intimidating, and cheaper as far as, paying for us to push the paper. So that's what we're doing. Any questions before we see if there's any testimony?
Yes. Can you anticipate my question?
Cottage clusters?
Yes.
I think I can. So the good news is we're going to get this done, and it'll be behind us. And I'm hoping to get through this development season, and I don't know how long that's going to take. I don't want to start any more code amendments in the near future, especially right now. Everybody's chomping at the bit to get stuff going before the rainy season starts. But another component is the state is funding housing needs analysis
Right.
for various cities, including us. We're locked and loaded. I don't know if John talked about the memorandum of understanding.
Yeah,
Okay,
did.
so you're aware of it.
So if the results recommend a need for that type of housing, is that something that we will be looking at in the future?
Yeah, there's a few different components of the housing needs analysis, and one is recommendations to explore. And I think that's a really good platform to do it with, because you have the analysis shows the need, and then it's all justified, and there may be other things too.
Okay.
So yeah, no, we remembered you. Yeah, we know that's
Okay.
something you want. Any other questions?
So I think it was just the owner living in one and then could rent the other. It was kind of a hot topic at the planning commission.
Yeah, the planning commission. So conceivably, the way the rules are proposed right now
Yeah.
is you could have your principal dwelling and the ADU both be rentals, and so to speak, old school provision for ADUs was that one of those needs to be owner occupied.
Yeah.
And the planning commission, I think they read some article or something, so it was fresh in their mind when we were talking about the size requirement, and they were concerned about taking that out because how it could affect the feel of neighborhoods.
But it wasn't unanimous.
It was not. Yeah, it was
Not
it was a
unanimous.
split
It was
decision. It was a split majority.
It was split, and because it was just a conversation, they didn't hash it out all the way down to the microbe, so they didn't actually take a vote.
And it was
how-
pretty late too.
So pardon me. So no size requirements, basically? What are the size requirements? and what are the conditions of the existing dwelling compared to the auxiliary unit? Is there any conditions on that at all? The width, size, height, and style?
Yes, yes, and yes.
Okay.
Size, it's supposed to be smaller. It can be no more than 75% of the living area of the dwelling unit, or 1,200 square feet, whichever is less. Height, it can't be higher than the dwelling unit. You still have your setbacks and lot coverage rules that apply. And so if a property's maxed out in lot coverage, they're going to have to add the ADU to
Right.
the existing footprint. We do have style provisions, so the ADU is not alien to the principal structure unless, as I mentioned, it is a pre-existing legal accessory structure.
Okay.
Okay.
Good
Are
work.
these then looked at as one property? So in the future, if the owner decides to sell it, it's sold as one property, or it can each be sold separately?
It's one per lot developed with a detached single-family dwelling. So it's meant to go with the property.
Okay, so they're sold
Not
together.
dividable.
Yeah,
Okay, that's,
yeah. It's a package. Yep.
thank you.
Still minimum setback 5 foot, or is there even a setback rule on obviously not with the basement?
Yeah, the standard for additions and new ones, the standard setbacks still apply. For those of you who have been around, probably most of you except for Mayor Scholl, a couple years back, we amended our rules to allow an increase in lot coverage in addition to a decrease in setback for new accessory structures and additions to homes. And we went ahead and folded this into that. So there is a little bit of flexibility in those provisions for these.
Okay.
I have a type 1 question.
Oh, home occupation question?
Yeah.
Sure.
I just wanted a clarity of the vehicle sign. We're not going to consider a vehicle sign to be a disqualifying feature for a home occupation type 1.
That's correct.
And so if I do pesticides for Orkin and I have an Orkin truck and somebody reports to me that I'm running a business out of my home, you're not going to come haul me in. Is what my point. I see a lot of trucks in our town that are wrapped for business. And so that's no longer a disqualifying factor. People can park their cars in front of their home.
Yeah, we would say that's exempt.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure because you talked about it, and I wanted to make sure that I understood where it landed.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure.
That's it.
All right. I think, does anybody want to talk in support of this? We can always count on Al.
Al Peterson, 101 St. Helens Street. I have 3 topics that I wanted to comment on. The signage issue was a good thing to get rid of because it was a long broiling item in Columbia City, and they finally got rid of it. And it caused neighbor conflicts and everything else, and you don't want it. I want to comment on the size of the ADU. The 1,200 square feet, I testified at the Planning Commission, and the 1,200 square feet more or less comes from the ability to design an ADA accessible unit, 2 bedrooms. I did a quick search. I didn't try to design one, but I did a quick search because it was easier on home plans online, and the smallest 2-bedroom fully accessible home that you can find on the internet is 1,100 square feet. And that's really pushing it. You can do it. But, 1,200 square feet is a reasonable 2-bedroom that you can, if you want to, make the thing 100% ADA accessible. So that's more or less where kind of that number came from. The owner occupancy, I'm kind of on the fence on that, but I'm sort of on getting rid of it, and the only reason is because there are a lot of rentals in St. Helens, and in some areas someone could argue that it's just the fact that there's a lot of rentals decreases the neighborhood, but they're all over town. So, and I think it's going to be very difficult to regulate. The one thing I do want to talk about, or briefly, because it was brought up by Susan, was the cottage housing, and it really has nothing to do with what you have in this ordinance. I'm in favor of it. However, I did, and Jacob and I have discussed this. Well, actually, we discussed it, but he didn't hear my conclusion. I did mention it to Jenny. In the AR zone, it would be very easy to allow cottage housing simply by redefining the definition of a duplex. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I have a client right now who has a odd property, and I'm trying to design for them a essentially cluster housing. But because there's an existing duplex on the property, and the way our definition of a duplex is written, Jacob and I have a difference of opinion about the intent of the ordinance. But basically it says, duplexes, the intent of duplexes is that you have two houses on a single family lot. But in the apartment zone, that really doesn't apply, but that's the way it's written. So the interpretation, if you read the language strictly the way the language is written, you cannot have a cottage housing with a triplex and a duplex, because that duplex isn't allowed. It's not on its own lot separately. So that would be an easy fix, in my view, of the AR zone, and then you could get essentially cottage housing. So I wanted to mention that because I think that particular little problem could be easily solved. So
and now you may want to explore a variance on that particular case.
Well, that's what. Yeah,
okay.
I'm going to talk to my clients
All
about that. But it's just one of those things that if you want to get the allowance of cluster or cottage housing, in the AR zone you can do it with a very minor tweak. So anyway.
Thank you.
More testimony in opposition, or excuse me.
In favor.
I'm so used to saying opposition from last hearing. In favor.
Okay, I'm Linda Zoll, and as everyone here knows me, I'm all for housing and housing for everybody. And I think many times when we think about auxiliary dwelling units, we're thinking about people making more money, whereas many times the auxiliary dwelling unit serves a completely different purpose. And it is to care for our loved ones. It cares for our elderly. Mom can come back and live at home and be cared for those who can take care of her the best, our handicapped children, etc. So my story is that we moved to this area over 20 years ago, and my mother had just passed away. So I had my father, and he came and camped out on my couch, and I couldn't get him off of it. And then I had my father-in-law say, "Oh my God, I've got to retire, and I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't have a retirement." And my husband and I looked at each other and we said, well, we saw this property out in St. Helens that we could buy. And so that's how we ended up moving in together. At first, it was that my parents-in-law would get a hardship, and because we're in the county. But that has to do with this issue, in that we were going to get a hardship, but then it was said, a lot of barriers were put in the way, and then finally it was said no. And so we ended up subdividing. They put a manufactured home. So we still live together, but they had to actually have a completely different lot. We built our house, and we made sure that there was a handicapped bathroom and a handicapped room downstairs that my father could live in, or my parents-in-law as they aged, and sure enough, we've used that very well. Now my father is passed on, my father-in-law's passed on, still got my mother-in-law around, and now we have a handicapped daughter that suddenly occurred as an adult. And she doesn't want to live with her parents forever. She'd like to have her own place. And so as she gets better, that's what we hope, is that she will have her own place. An alternative dwelling unit serves those purposes. And so having the least restrictions, I love it. it allows people to have that place, to build it in a form that is usable. So that comes up to what Agnes was talking about, and what her dear son here was talking about, that you can't have a dwelling unit that is handicapped accessible that is too small. So I have a couple plans here that I printed out, and one has to do with a 1-bedroom, and one has to do with a 2-bedroom. Some of us, we can have an ADU just being a 1-bedroom, and you know, we're looking at 800 square feet minimum. And that's really, you know, because you need to have these wide hallways, these wide doors, very large bathroom. To us, it would seem like a suite, but to truly be handicapped accessible. But many of our loved ones, they're still caring for somebody. It might be a child that's handicapped, but that child has a child. It might be a parent come back to stay at home, but it's actually 2 parents. And if they're both ill, they both need a room. They both have their equipment. It's, you know, their hospital bed, etc. And so really, I'd like to see ADUs with this generous, you know, square footage of 1,200. And again, I found also you know, just the stock floor plan. And again, it does, exactly like he said, come up to 1,100 square feet, and I'll give each of you a copy of that. A couple issues. I agree about not having it owner-occupied requirement, because how do you enforce that? I might build an ADU onto my house, but when I have to sell, someone else buying it, does that mean that they have to, or let's say I move because of a job, does that mean that I have to have one unit not being used at all because I could only rent out half of my property? And that really defeats the purpose of trying to have housing. So I would really, you know, like to continue with this idea of having it not owner-occupied. About, let's see, I think one other issue about parking. I really think that, you know, new construction definitely should have it arranged that off-street parking is planned for. We talked previously about whether that needs to be a completely different designated parking space. So for example, when you build the house, that house would have, let's say, a 2-car garage. Can you consider behind one of, you know, in the driveway being a parking space for the ADU? And I would, so I guess that's called tandem parking. I would like that to be considered because, you know, we also have to think about drainage. We live in a very rainy area. So just putting more, you know, concrete down just for the purpose of adding another car isn't necessarily the best for the environment. So I'd like to give each of you a copy of this. Should I just hand it to you, or should I pass it around?
Yeah, we can start this way and then pass it down that way.
Thank you. Okay, thanks.
Do we have any? Oh, are you done, Linda?
Yes.
Okay. Any more testimony and support?
Steve Topaz, St. Helens Street. I used to live in Maryland, and the lot size in Maryland was 25 feet, I believe, by 150 feet. was laid down by the king when they set up as a colony. And if you go downtown Baltimore, the row house is an excellent example of that, except all the properties in the state were laid out on that same design. And St. Helens has what I'd call a minimal lot size, and it was laid out some time ago, and not with a whole lot of sense where the topography is. And the question is, what happens when we say, oh, you need 2 lots to build on, so you need 100 by 100 rather than 50 by 100? Right now, we're basically looking all at a particular size house, and if you add 100 or 1,200 feet to another shack behind it, it kind of makes sense. But if you change lot size, it doesn't. Now, a great deal of this town was built mainly because the workers couldn't afford a real house. So we have some history as far as lot size and the type of houses, and now we're trying to modify that. I think we probably ought to look at, if I have a reasonable size house, which may be a lot and a half or bigger than now, and now I put another house because I've got a relative or a friend. See, the other thing, it seems to be we're basing on relatives rather than a friend or a companion that needs help. And we're starting to get iffy because now the person is an invalid. Now I have an invalid and I have a new job. Now the invalid can't move because everything in the house is here. The person has a live-in nurse, if you would, or somebody to take care of them, and yet I'm in another city. We've got some funny rules that we seem to be locked into a particular size and a particular frame of mind. And the way families are moving and the way people are taking care of each other, we get in trouble. The other problem is we need more housing, and some of the people will not be here very long. Classically, the lumber towns, people were only here as long as there were trees in the mountainsides and when they moved, which kind of designated the type of properties we have now. But there are a lot of industries, and some of the engineering industries, I'm here as long as the project's here, and then I go to where the next project is. So this temporary rental, I think you need a better definition on rental, what you call short-term rental.
Yeah, we have added a definition to address that to the code. Currently, the development code does not have a definition of short-term rental. And I'm sorry, yeah. If I
keep going.
Okay. So short-term rental means the use of a dwelling unit or rooms within a dwelling unit by a person or groups of persons entitled to occupy for rent for a period of less than 31 consecutive days. So it's a time period.
Yeah, because as I say, that's another thing that's happening in our society. A lot of, especially military contracts, people will follow the contracts around, and they're not there for long term. But they are there longer than 30 days. So the question of what definition of short term was needed. But as I say, what happens when we decide that the homes in St. Helena ought to be bigger and you need 2 lots to build a house on?
So in that case, that happens. Sometimes someone has a house and they have a lot by it and they want to put a shed on it. And jurisdictions kind of do different things. Typically what we've done is require the lots to be bound by covenant, which says that they're supposed to stay together. And the city can release that in the future. But so then those 2 lots are treated as one. Now you have more breathing room for your ADU if so desired.
Because as I say, what's happening in a lot of parts of Maryland, you need 2 lots to build on as compared to one. That is now the law. You just can't do it. And that's the real question. I assume there's going to be some changes in town. Right now our thinking, our designs based on our present lot. And that's one of the things. The other thing on topography, it says higher than the main dwelling. With some of the bumps and hills in this, if I put it in back, and the backyard is 20 feet higher than the front yard, where does that catch me with the new.
Oh, well, yeah, so then it gets to the definition of building height,
Yeah.
which is technically the average elevation 20 feet around the building from the base to the top of peak. And
Okay.
so, topography, you may have an ADU that's very visible. The idea is that the ADU is not this 40-foot tower, and your principal dwelling is a one-story
But
bungalow.
So I would make sure we have we'll say a harder definition of what we're measuring for height.
Yeah, and I think the code is very clear on that.
Okay.
And it seems to have served us okay.
Because as I say, if I look at the street, this one's 60 feet and that's 80 feet. They're both 40 feet high. It's just the lot goes like
Yep.
that.
No,
That,
I hear
that was
ya.
the real question. Thank you.
Sure. Any more testimony in favor? Yeah, we can throw you in as neutral. Sure.
Shauna Harrison. So, in regards to the ADU, are you going to require that they have their own utility hookups? Or are they going to be attached to the dwelling? So, like
That is a
water-
fantastic question. And it's something that we did talk about. And the answer is no, they can use the same meter, and that's going to result in a substantial savings in system development charges because it's on the same property, and it's something we talked about behind the scenes because of the potential costs of building one, so they can use the same meter because they're on the same property and because it's secondary or incidental to the primary dwelling.
What if they elected to want to have a separate meter? Could they?
I do not believe there would be an
Pro-
issue to that. I don't think the city would object.
If they want it, yeah.
Yeah.
Which obviously it's just an added expense.
It would be, yeah.
Okay. And then as far as short-term rentals, I mean, there's a lot of marketing about Airbnb, of course, especially ADUs in the city of Portland. So I realize that our ADU, as it stands right now, the provision is that there's no short-term, like he said, for 31 days. So essentially, if I wanted to rent out the house for 2 months at a time, the ADU, I could do that.
That would be the loophole, yep. So then it's quasi short term, but not short term by the definition of our
I'm
code.
going to start renting out all my stuff quarterly. Thank you very much. I'm just kidding. All right. That was it. That's all I had.
Okay.
Thank you.
So how much are we talking in the SDC charges for a permit of a 1,200 square foot? That's the maximum.
I don't.
Three bedroom, 1,200 square foot.
I don't have
Just roughly. Anybody? I think.
for 1,200 standard 1,200.
If they're on the same water and
Yeah.
sewer connection,
Well,
you'd be paying for just the storm drain fees, which
Okay.
is $821 per 2,500 square feet of impervious surface added.
Okay. Because Jacob made it sound like it was pretty significant as far as the.
Yeah, if you're sharing the water meter, because that's
The- Yeah, water and sewer, because I just looked those up.
Uh-huh.
If they got a new water meter, because that would mean that they would have the ability to use the maximum amount of water that would go through a water meter. So the 3/4 inch water meter, which is the smallest, the SDC is $3,361. The
Wow.
sewer is $4,117.
Over $7,000. Oh, that is big.
so use the same meter, boom, instant savings.
So if it's a rental, same address or you split the addresses?
Same principal number, it just have a unit like a B.
Okay.
Yeah. And we checked with the post office to see what they would want to see, and whatever it says, I think they preferred the letter instead of the 1/2.
So then whoever owns the meter is responsible for the water bill.
Yep.
So those will work in any. It doesn't have to be R5. It can be R7. It can be R10.
Any zone that allows a detached single-family dwelling. And our zoning is very detached
Yes.
single-family
Yes, friendly.
centric.
Yes.
Some communities, a good example is our apartment residential zone. Some communities would make the detached single-family dwelling more challenging in that zone because it's supposed to be high density. St. Helens, it's still an outright permitted use. And so throughout town, mixed use, anywhere where you can have a detached single-family dwelling, you can have an ADU.
So I got a real big red flag coming up though, because I just see that sometimes developments are going to be planned around ADUs, and if there's no owner occupied, I understand where their concerns are with the planning commission on that. Because if I can develop and plot out for a 2,000 square foot home, and that allows me to do a 1,200 foot ADU in the R10 zone or R7 zone, I'm going to do it because it's going to be that much more rent.
Sure. Yeah.
So you've just taken two houses into a 7,000 square foot footprint, and we have people here. Our last big meeting was trying to rezone what was recommended to an R7, and actually it was Zoll. And trying to bring it to an R5 because it was between two R7s.
Yeah, these are
are we going to be back here in another big public hearing if we don't really look at these things really, really closely?
I admit there's controversy, especially with people who are comfortable in their low density neighborhoods.
Yes.
But I think the state recognized that. I mean, the state basically said you have to do something.
Mm-hmm. I get it.
And you know, there's cars, there's traffic, there's a lot of questions that come up. But the fact as the matter is we have this affordable housing issue, and this is one of the tools. Now, an interesting thing I read recently is the city of Portland, only 1% of the lots eligible for ADUs in the city of Portland have them. But, you know, we have new subdivisions coming in, and certainly we could see that. And so I guess when I said this is preventing the torches and pitchforks, maybe it's going to be a catalyst to future torches and pitchforks. But what do? The state says you need to do it. We're trying to adopt the best rules that we can. I think the discussion that we've had with some of the sit-ins has been productive, and I guess I'm certainly welcome to hear the alternative.
Well, no, the law is the law when it comes to codes. I mean, and you interpret it the way it's written at the state. So I get it. That's all. I just wanted to state that for the record that I foresee a very big meeting coming this way.
For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. Is there any more testimony in favor of this? Any testimony in opposition? Any last questions before we close the public hearing?
Nope. Public hearing closed. Hang tight with the